I awakened as an F-class inventor, but my machines made me an SSS-class warlord. Book 1. Ashes and Awakening. Prologue. Years from now, this isn't the scene you'd put in a history book, but it's the one that actually happened, so it'll have to do. He's on one knee in the mud, catching his breath, one hand braced against a construct that isn't moving anymore. Somewhere up the ridge, somebody's shouting a name down at him. Except it isn't his name. Hasn't been for a while now. 2 syllables. The kind of word people reach for when the normal ones stop being enough. He doesn't look up right away. Give him that much, whatever he's about to be to the rest of the world. Right now, he's just a tired guy, checking whether the thing he built with his own 2 hands is going to make it. It isn't. He sets it down anyway. Careful, the way you'd set down something that used to matter to you. Around him, the field is still moving. Hundreds of smaller shapes. Sand and scrap and something that isn't quite metal. All of it turning at once, like a breath being let out slow. He built every piece of it. It still listens when he thinks at it, which is either the strangest sentence in the world or just Tuesday, depending on the year you ask him. Years ago, none of this would have made a lick of sense to him either. Back then, he was an orphan in a valley town most maps didn't bother naming. And the biggest problem in his life was a clock tower that wouldn't chime right. Honestly, that's as good a place as any to start. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Talked to Broken Things. The clock tower in Ashenreach hadn't chimed correctly in 6 years, and Kael Rennick was the only person in town who still climbed up to try and fix it. He was 15, narrow-shouldered, with soot permanently ground into the creases of his knuckles, no matter how hard Sister Marin scrubbed them before chapel service. His hair was the color of wet straw and never sat right, mostly because he cut it himself with a pair of shears meant for hedges. None of that mattered to him nearly as much as the sound currently coming from the tower's gear housing. A stuttering tick, tick, clunk that had been driving him quietly insane for a week. "You're going to fall and break your fool neck," said old Fen from the ladder below, not looking up from the cart axle he was resetting. "And then who fixes my delivery cart?" "Nobody's falling," Kael said, wedging himself further into the housing, lantern held between his teeth. The gear train in front of him was a mess of mismatched parts. Half of it forged decades ago by a smith who was clearly guessing. The other half patched by Kael himself over the last 2 years with scavenged brass. It's not the mainspring. Everyone always blames the mainspring. Is that so? It's the third idler gear. Someone replaced it with one that's got a tooth count that doesn't match the ratio. It's been grinding itself flatter every day for probably a decade. Kael ran his thumb along the offending gear, feeling the wear pattern like braille. It's not broken. It's just been asked to do a job it was never built for. Fen grunted, which from Fen was practically a standing ovation. There was something Kael never said out loud, because the one time he'd tried, at age 11, the other orphanage kids had laughed so hard that Pell Dunmore threw up from laughing. And that was the nice reaction. What Kael never said was that when he touched machines like this, when he really listened, it didn't feel like guessing. It felt like the metal was telling him something. Not words. Nothing so tidy. More like intention. This gear wants to turn this way. This spring is tired. This joint is lonely for oil. He'd assumed, for years, that this was just what being good with your hands felt like from the inside. He would find out, very soon, that it was not that at all. Ashenreach sat in a shallow valley 2 weeks' ride from the capital, which was exactly far enough that most of what happened here didn't matter to anyone who mattered. It had one temple, one guild outpost with 3 permanently stationed hunters, one market square, a scrapyard Fen ran with the quiet authority of a man who'd once been something more, and, crowding the valley's western edge close enough to see from the chapel steps, the black, silent tree line of the Ashwood Deep. Every kid in Ashenreach grew up on stories about the deep, the way children elsewhere grew up on stories about the sea. Something vast, half understood, worth respecting more than fearing, right up until the day it wasn't. Rifts tore open around the valley, more often than most places, and not every beast that came through got killed cleanly. The ones that ran instead of fought, the ones the hunters missed in the chaos, didn't just disappear when the rift sealed behind them. They fled for the tree line, over generations, that had turned the Ashwood Deep into something the guild pamphlets described, with careful diplomatic blandness, as an area of elevated wild density, and something everyone in town simply called the Deep, in the tone you'd use for a dangerous relative you still had to be polite to at dinner. Nock's brother says there's things in there past the second ring that'd make a dusk hound look like a house cat. Pell Dunmore had told the younger chapel kids once, delighted with himself, and gotten smacked by Sister Marin's wooden spoon for scaring the little ones. Kael, 12 at the time, had privately thought it sounded less like a scary story and more like an engineering problem. Why does danger scale with depth? What's actually down there? Has anyone ever mapped it? And had gotten exactly nowhere trying to explain that this was the interesting part. What Kael loved, the thing that made the other kids at the chapel roll their eyes and the other kids at the market square throw things, was not beasts, or fighting, or the hunters swaggering back through the gate with cores glowing in their palms like they'd caught the sun. What Kael loved was everything else. The water wheel that turned the mill, the crank mechanism on the well pump, the strange half-broken machine old Fen kept in the back of the scrapyard under a tarp that nobody, not even Fen, seemed to fully understand. A thing with too many gears and a housing made of a metal Kael had never seen anywhere else, dull gray-green and cool even in summer heat. That's not from around here, Fen had told him once. The only time Kael had ever gotten him to talk about it. Not from any smith I've ever met. Dug it half buried after a rift sealed up right at the deep's edge, maybe 15 years back. He'd looked at Kael sideways then, in a way Kael hadn't understood at the time. Same season I lost this, he'd added, nodding at the empty sleeve pinned neatly at his shoulder, and offered nothing further, which was as close as Fen ever came to a full stop in a sentence. Kael had spent every spare hour since then trying to get the old machine running. He hadn't managed it. But 3 nights ago, hand flat against its cold gray housing, eyes closed, he could have sworn that something in it had hummed back. He got a smaller, more immediate demonstration of exactly how badly his instincts and his execution could disagree about 20 minutes later, back at the chapel, when his attempt to rig a self-resetting latch for the kitchen door so that Sister Marin wouldn't have to keep propping it with a brick, instead deposited an entire sack of flour directly onto Father Bastien's head the first time anyone touched the handle. The resulting silence, Father Bastien standing in the doorway, coated head to toe in white, one eyebrow raised through the powder, lasted a solid 5 seconds before Wren Cabot, perched on the kitchen table where she had absolutely no business sitting, burst out laughing so hard she nearly fell off it. In my defense, Kael said, into the silence, the tension calibration was very close to correct. Kael Rennick, Father Bastien said, with the weary patience of a man who had, over the years, developed genuine affection for a boy who kept accidentally endangering the kitchen. I am going to need you to test your devices on people who are not me. Test it on Bryce, Wren suggested immediately, wiping her eyes. Genuinely, community service, Kael grinned. The first real, easy grin he'd had all day, and helped Father Bastien scrape flour out of his eyebrows. And for a little while, with Wren still snorting into her sleeve and the priest pretending to be sterner than he was, Ashenreach felt exactly as small and safe and unremarkable as it always had. That feeling lasted until nightfall, when the guild outpost's warning horn sounded twice, sharp and close, from the direction of the western fields. the signal for a fresh rift, opening somewhere near the deep's edge. And every adult in the chapel went very quiet, very fast, in the particular way of people counting how many days it had been since the last one. 6 days till awakening day, Wren said quietly, watching the horn light flare against the darkening tree line through the kitchen window. All the laughter gone out of her voice. Feels like a bad time for the deep to be getting restless. Kael didn't have an answer for that. He wouldn't, for a while yet, have any idea just how right she was. Chapter 2. The Awakening Bell. Awakening Day in Ashenreach began the way it always did, with the whole town crammed into the square in front of the temple. Breath fogging in the cold, the Hunter Guild's traveling adjudicator standing on a raised platform with the resonance lamp. A device like a lantern crossed with a spider, the only tool in the known world capable of reading the shape of a person's newly woken power and giving it a name. There were 19 15-year-olds in Ashenreach this year. Kael stood near the back of the line, hands jammed in his coat pockets, one fist curled around the idler gear he still hadn't returned to the clock tower. Wren stood beside him, arms crossed, doing a poor job of pretending she wasn't nervous. Leora was 3 places ahead of them both, hair braided specially for the occasion, practically vibrating. Bryce Colder went first, broad for 15, already built like his blacksmith father. The lamp flared gold. "Spearman, E rank!" The crowd cheered, and Bryce turned around with a grin aimed squarely at Kael. Like this was a competition Kael hadn't known he'd entered. Garrick Hale went 6th. Gold flare, warm applause. "Swordsman, E rank!" Leora clapped harder for Garrick than she had for the last 4 names combined, though Kael didn't think anything of it at the time. Wren went 8th. The lamp gave a pale, papery yellow-white light. "Scribe, F rank." A polite, thin smattering of applause. Scribes could copy documents faster and more accurately once leveled. Useful for a merchant's ledger. Nobody's idea of exciting. And Wren walked off the platform with her chin up and her jaw tight, and squeezed Kael's hand once, hard, on her way past, in a way that said, "Your turn next. Don't you dare flinch." Leora went 9th. Soft silver blue. Alchemist, F rank, a smaller cheer, polite rather than enthusiastic, and Kael caught the flash of tight disappointment on her face before she smoothed it into a smile for the crowd. Then it was Kael's turn. He walked up to the platform, aware of every eye in the square, aware in a way he usually managed not to be, of how his boots didn't quite fit right, and his coat was 2 winters old. The adjudicator, a tired-looking woman with silver hair and the particular patience of someone who'd done this in 40 towns before this one, held the resonance lamp toward him and murmured the activation phrase. The lamp flared. It didn't flare gold, or violet, or even the soft silver blue that had named Leora an alchemist. It sputtered, an ugly, uneven brown-gray light, dim and stuttering, like a lantern with a clogged wick, and held there a long, uncomfortable moment before the adjudicator's professionally neutral expression flickered into something that might have been surprise, or might have been pity. "Inventor, F rank. Inventor." Silence, and then laughter. Not everyone. Sister Marin didn't laugh. Wren definitely didn't laugh. Father Bastian looked like he wanted to march up and confiscate the entire resonance lamp on principle. But enough. Rolling under the surface, kids nudging each other. Bryce loudest of all. "Inventor," Bryce repeated, delighted. "F-rank inventor. That's not even a real thing. That's just tinkering. You awoke tinkering." "Enough," the adjudicator said, flat, in the voice of someone who'd said it 1,000 times and no longer expected it to work. It didn't work. Kael stood on the platform a moment longer than he needed to and looked out at the crowd for Leora. She wasn't laughing, That was something. But she wasn't looking at him the way she'd looked at Garrick either. System notification. Class awakened. Inventor. F rank. Category support. Combat aptitude. None detected. Utility aptitude. Mechanical affinity. Elevated. A latent trait has been detected but not yet classified. Further data required. The words hovered in the corner of his vision for exactly 4 seconds and vanished. And Kael, walking numbly off the platform to the sound of Bryce's friends imitating a sputtering, dying lamp, decided he had imagined it. He was still deciding that, 10 minutes later, standing with Ren at the edge of the thinning crowd, when the warning horn split the morning air. Not the 2 short blasts of a fresh rift this time, but 3 long ones. The signal that meant something's already through the line. The square went from festive to controlled chaos in about 4 seconds. Hunters who'd been lounging at the ceremony's edges were suddenly moving with purpose. Joran the spearman shouting for civilians to clear back toward the temple steps, parents grabbing children, the newly awakened warriors, Bryce and Garrick among them, visibly torn between excitement and terror at the idea their very first day of power might come with an actual test attached. It turned out to be small. A pair of sandjaws, low rank and disoriented, had wandered out from the deep's outer edge through a rift seam nobody had flagged in time, more interested in fleeing the noise of the ceremony than attacking it. Joran and the outpost's second hunter put them down in under a minute, clean and almost bored about it, and the horn sounded the all clear before most of the crowd had even finished panicking. But Kael, standing frozen with Ren's hand locked around his wrist, had felt something in that minute that had nothing to do with fear of the sandjaws at all. He'd felt it in his chest, a faint, electric tug, like a held breath, pulling toward the tree line as the beasts came through, gone the instant the horn sounded all clear. Query. Operator status? Extended dormancy detected. Requesting. Authorization. Kael's blood went cold. He looked around. Nobody else had reacted. Nobody else apparently had heard anything at all. You all right? Ren asked, watching his face. You've gone the color of Father Bastian's flower. Yeah, Kael said, faintly, staring at nothing. Yeah, I think I just heard something. Chapter 3. F is for forgotten. Whatever Kael had heard in the chaos of the Sandjaw scare didn't come back. Not that afternoon. Not that night. No matter how many times he sat with his hand pressed to his own chest like an idiot, waiting. By the next morning, he'd half convinced himself Ren was right, and he'd just been lightheaded from the crowd and the horn and the general catastrophe of his own awakening. The week that followed was, he'd decide later, the worst of his life up to that point. A distinction that would not survive very long, but felt permanent at the time. Ashen Reach didn't waste time recalibrating around its new warriors. Bryce Calder had already been given a training slot with Joran, who slapped him on the back like a colleague. Garrick Hale's father threw a party half the town attended, Leora among them, laughing at something Garrick said. A full, genuine laugh, Kael realized. With a small cold drop in his stomach, he hadn't heard directed at himself in weeks. Nobody threw Kael a party. There wasn't a training slot for an F-rank inventor. We'll put your name on file, said Denner Holt, the outpost's requisition officer, looking at Kael's registration slip with the specific weariness of a man whose entire job was managing everyone's disappointment at once. Sometimes there's tool repair work. Don't hold your breath. He caught Kael's face and softened a little. For what it's worth, F-rank's not a life sentence. Some folks level. Depends on the class. Depends on the person. How does an inventor level, exactly? Ren asked. Because she'd come along for moral support and had, in the last week, appointed herself Kael's unofficial advocate in all matters bureaucratic. Denner scratched his neck. Honestly? Not sure. Most support classes level off combat proximity same as anyone. Beat something. Absorb its core, get stronger. assuming your class can actually use combat energy. Inventors mostly can't, so mostly they just work. Fix carts, mend fences. Rank creeps up slow if it moves at all. He glanced at the window, toward the dark smudge of the deep on the western horizon, and added, almost to himself, guilds flagged increased activity out past the second ring, past few months. More rifts, sealing without a clean beast count after, means more things running for the tree line, instead of dying like they're supposed to. Not exactly the year I'd picked to be short on combat-viable awakeners. Kael filed that away with the same part of his brain that filed away worn gear teeth and mismatched tooth counts. A problem shape. Even if he didn't yet understand what it meant, old Fen didn't say anything about the awakening for 3 days, which Kael appreciated more than he could have said. He just kept handing Kael tools, kept setting projects in front of him. A jammed loom mechanism, a busted lock from the temple's donation box, and let Kael work with his hands until the noise in his head went quiet. It was on the 4th day, elbow deep in the loom's tangled tension bar, that Fen finally spoke. "You feel anything different? Since the ceremony?" Kael considered lying, out of habit, and then didn't. During the Sandjaw scare, for about a minute I felt, I don't know, something. Like a voice that wasn't quite a voice. It's not come back since. Fen went very still, in a way that made the loom mechanism suddenly feel much less interesting. "Go put your hand on the machine in the back," he said. "The one under the tarp." Kael did. The gray-green housing was cold as always, unresponsive as always. And then, for just a moment, under his palm, he felt it again. That faint hum. That sense of something vast and patient stirring just beneath the surface, like a sleeper who has heard their name called, but hasn't yet decided whether to wake. Soon, something said, not in words, in the way a held breath says soon right before it's released. "Fen," Kael said, not opening his eyes. "What is this thing?" "Don't know for certain," Fen admitted. "But I know what I saw 15 years back, right at the deep's edge, minutes after a rift sealed behind a duskhound pack that damn near took my arm with it. I saw a boy, younger than you, sitting in the wreckage talking to a pile of scrap metal like it could hear him. And I saw the scrap metal answer. Boy vanished before I could reach him. Left this behind." He shrugged, an old, worn gesture that didn't match the weight of what he just said. "Never told anyone that story. People'd think I was cracked, but I've run this yard 20 years, kid. And you're the first thing that's ever touched anything in this lot and made it feel like it was listening back." Kael opened his eyes. "You think I'm like him, that boy?" "I think," Fen said. "Frank Inventor is what the resonance lamp calls you when it doesn't have a better word yet. Give it time." It wasn't much. It was the only real kindness anyone outside the chapel had offered Kael all week. That, and Wren showing up at the scrapyard every evening, with half a loaf of bread she claimed Sister Marin had accidentally made too much of. Sitting on the workbench doing absolutely nothing useful except keeping him company while he worked, occasionally reading aloud from a guild pamphlet in the most sarcastic voice she could manage, until he laughed despite himself. "The dedicated support class awakener," she read, in a plummy, self-important tone, "finds fulfillment in service to their community." Kael, find fulfillment in service to Bryce Colder's boots. Presumably. "I hate you," Kael said, grinning despite everything, and held on to both kindnesses. Fen's story, Wren's terrible pamphlet voice, the way he held on to the idler gear in his pocket. Small, hard things to close his fist around when the rest of the world got loud. Chapter 4. The Weight of Empty Pockets. Liara broke it off on a Sunday, which Kael would later think was almost funny, in the way that only truly unfunny things can be. She chose the 1 day a week Sister Marin insisted the whole chapel attend service, so that Kael had to sit through an hour of hymns afterward, with his chest hollowed out and his face arranged into something that wouldn't invite questions. She found him behind the market stalls, where they used to meet after his shifts at the scrapyard. She was wearing a new shawl, blue wool, finer than anything he'd seen her in before. Capital quality weave, some distant part of his brain noted. Not local. I think we should. She stopped, visibly annoyed at herself for not saying it the way she'd clearly practiced, and started over, flatter this time. We should stop. This. Us. Okay, Kael said, because his voice had apparently decided honesty was easier than dignity. Can I ask why? Kael, she said his name like it was an explanation in itself. You're an F-rank inventor. Do you understand what that means? It means fixing looms for the rest of your life while everyone else… She caught herself, softened the edge, tried again. I have a shop opportunity. Garrick's family is putting up capital for an alchemist storefront. In the capital. Real customers, real rank progression, real life. Not a gesture that took in the scrapyard, the market stalls, all of Ashenreach, all of him. Garrick's family, Kael repeated slowly, and something that had been assembling itself in the back of his mind for 2 weeks finally clicked into place. Tooth against tooth, gear against gear. You've been spending time with Garrick. That's not the point. How much did I lend you? For the alchemy supplies. Back before the ceremony. He wasn't even angry yet. He was doing math, the way he did math on everything, because numbers didn't have feelings attached, and feelings were currently unbearable. 11 silver. Over 4 months. You said you'd pay me back once you had your shop. Liara's jaw tightened. I'll pay you back, once things are settled. With Garrick's money. Don't make this ugly, Kael. And there it was. The thing underneath the tired exasperation. The thing he'd been too fond of her to see clearly until exactly this moment. Not cruelty, precisely. Something colder and more practical than cruelty. You'll be fine. You're smart. You'll figure something out. A pause, like an afterthought that cost her nothing. I hope you level. I really do. She left. Kael stood behind the market stalls with 11 silver he'd never see again, and a hollow, ringing feeling in his chest. And for the first time since awakening day, let himself feel, fully, exactly how alone he was. Ren found him 20 minutes later, because Ren had a talent for finding him exactly when he most needed finding, and pretending it was a coincidence. I could put something extremely unpleasant in Garrick's boots, she offered, sitting down next to him on the low market wall without asking if he wanted company. Which was correct, because he did. As a scribe, I've got no idea what an F-rank scribe could even do to a boot, but I'm prepared to workshop it. You'd get in trouble. I'm already in trouble. I'm an F-rank scribe, Kael. I have achieved the absolute floor of trouble. There is nowhere lower for me to go. She bumped his shoulder with hers. For what it's worth, she's an idiot. You're going to level, and she's going to spend the rest of her life explaining to people why she dated the future. Ren gestured vaguely. Whatever you're going to end up being. And then dumped him for a boy whose entire personality has a sword. Kael laughed, short and a little wet, and didn't argue. Mostly because arguing would have required more composure than he currently had. He didn't go back to the chapel that night. He went to the scrapyard instead, let himself in with the spare key Fen had given him months ago, and sat down in front of the tarp-covered machine in the back, because it was the only thing in Ashenreach that had never once made him feel small. Everyone gets a warrior, he said out loud, to no one, to the tarp, to the cold. Everyone gets something that matters. I get tinkering. He laughed, short and humorless. Frank. F for forgotten. He pulled the tarp back and put both hands flat on the gray-green housing, more out of habit than hope. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the rawness in his chest, cracked open in a way it hadn't been before. Maybe it was 3 weeks of quiet, patient stirring. The Sandjaw scare, Fenn's story, all of it. Finally reaching whatever threshold it had been building toward. The hum under his palms stopped being a hum. It became a voice. Query. Operator status? Extended dormancy detected. Requesting. Authorization. Kael went very, very still. Hello? He said, to a machine, in an empty scrapyard, at midnight, and felt like the biggest fool in Ashenreach, right up until the machine answered him back. Chapter 5. Static in the dark. Operator status confirmed. Resuming primary function. The voice? If it was a voice. And Kael was still very much unsure whether he'd finally cracked under the accumulated weight of the worst month of his life. Didn't come from his ears. It arrived somewhere behind his sternum, cool and precise, like a held breath of winter air. I need you to understand, Kael said carefully, to the machine, to the dark scrapyard, to whatever was listening, that I have had an extremely bad month, and if this is a hallucination, I would really appreciate it not getting worse. Clarification. This is not a hallucination. Neural mechanical resonance link established. Operator classification. Machinist. Confidence, 94%. And then the world tilted, the way it had on the awakening platform. Except this time, the light that bloomed in front of his eyes wasn't the sputtering brown-gray of a public humiliation. It was clean, sharp, and entirely his own. System notification. Class reawakened. Machinist. Category hybrid. Support unclassified. Trigger condition met. Extreme circumstance evolution. Emotional threshold plus sustained latent resonance. Base class retained. Inventor. F rank. Now foundational subskill. New aptitude unlocked. Machine communion. Kael Rennick may sense the function, condition, and intent of any mechanical or rift-forged device within range, and may communicate directly with sufficiently complex constructs. Rank reassignment pending. Insufficient data. Awakener must demonstrate capability before classification can be finalized. Evolution path preview. Locked. Note: this class does not appear in standard guild registries. Proceed with discretion. Kael read it 3 times, hands shaking against the housing. You're a machine. You're actually talking to me. Correct. Designation. Unit designation lost. Extended dormancy caused partial memory corruption. Recommend operator assign new designation. Query. Does operator require assistance? Kael laughed, a strange wet sound halfway to a sob. Yeah, he said. Yeah, I think I do. It took him the rest of the night to understand even the shape of what had happened. The resonance lamp had named him Inventor because Inventor was the closest word the guild's registries had for mechanical affinity, and mechanical affinity was as far as the ceremony's magic could see into him. What lay underneath had apparently been dormant, tangled up with something in his blood or his soul or wherever these things actually lived, waiting for the trigger the system called extreme circumstance. Historical query returns partial match. Designation machinist appears in deep archive fragments predating current guild registry standards. Class believed extinct or unregistered for approximately 200 cycles. Recommend. Do not disclose classification to unauthorized personnel. You mean don't tell anyone. Confirmed. Kael thought about Bryce's laugh, about Denner's careful don't hold your breath, about Leora's I hope you level, I really do, tossed over her shoulder like a coin to a beggar. Something in his chest, still raw, hardened around a small, cold decision. Fine, he said. Nobody finds out. Not yet. He looked down at his own hands, soot-stained, ordinary, and felt For the first time in a month, something other than shame. What can you actually teach me? Extensive. Recommend beginning with blueprint synthesis. Warning. Current ether reserves are insufficient for anything beyond minimal scale construction. Recommend rest before proceeding. Blueprint synthesis. You mean I can build things from nothing? Not nothing. From raw material. Common substrate is sufficient at low tiers. Sand, clay, scrap metal, wood fiber, anything with structure the ether can bind. A schematic bloomed in Kael's vision, faint and half-formed, legs, a segmented body, something small enough to fit in his palm. At current tier, output capability is extremely limited. Growth is possible. How much growth? Kael asked. And then, because the question had been sitting in the back of his mind since Denner's offhand comment about the deep, added, Fen said this thing came out of the Ashwood Deep. Denner said things are getting worse out there. What's actually in that forest? Query outside current data priority. Answering regardless, given operator persistence. Rift-spawned beasts share the same rank designation as human awakeners, F through S, but the scale is not symmetric. A duskhound is common. A rift beast capable of contesting an S-rank hunter is exceedingly rare and regionally catastrophic when it occurs. And above S, the schematic in Kael's vision flickered, replaced for one unsettling half-second by something vast and shapeless that his mind refused to hold on to. SS and SSS rank entities are not battles. They are historical epochs. Fewer than a dozen confirmed in recorded history. If the Ashwood Deep's deep interior harbors what certain archive fragments suggest it might, operator's current priority should not be curiosity. It should be growth. There was a brief pause then, longer than Ashen's usual clipped delivery, as though the machine were weighing how much to say. One additional data point. Unprompted. Archive contains a single badly corrupted record, referencing a prior machinist who did not simply fight such entities. Record is fragmentary. Most identifying data lost, but the surviving fragment repeats one word with unusual consistency, a title, not a rank. I will not speculate further until you have earned the context to make the speculation meaningful. That's an incredibly frustrating thing to bring up and then not explain. Correct. Recommend patience. You are, at present, an E-rank machinist with one working scuttler and a bandaged palm. Ambition should scale with capability. Kael sat in the dark scrapyard, heart hammering, staring at a half-formed blueprint that existed only inside his own head, and felt, for the first time since the resonance lamp had sputtered its dim, humiliating brown-gray light over his head, something that was unmistakably, dangerously close to hope, laced through with something colder underneath it. Okay, he whispered. Show me everything. Chapter 6. Sparks and Scrap Metal. The machine, Kael had taken to calling it Ashen, after the town, turned out to be an extremely thorough, occasionally condescending teacher. Incorrect binding sequence, Ashen said, for the fourth time that evening, as the small pile of sand and scrap wire in front of Kael collapsed into an inert, sad little heap for the fourth time. Operator is attempting to force structural cohesion before establishing aether flow. This is equivalent to attempting to nail together boards before you have located the nails. I don't have any nails, Ashen. That's sort of the whole problem. Metaphorical. Recommend focus. He'd spent 2 days doing exactly what Ashen suggested. Resting, eating better courtesy of Sister Marin's assumption that his newly cheerful mood meant he was finally getting over Leora, and using every spare dark evening for what Ashen called synthesis drills. Small, deliberately unambitious attempts to shape raw material using nothing but aether, intention, and a design held in his mind. System notification. Skill acquired. Blueprint synthesis. Tier 0 novice. Current output ceiling. Constructs under 15 centimeters. Single material. Non-articulated. Ether cost scales with complexity, material resistance, and construct size. Warning: attempting synthesis beyond current tier risks, ether backlash, fatigue, dizziness, possible unconsciousness. So what you're saying, Kael said, wiping sweat off his forehead despite the cold, is that right now I could, theoretically, make a very small, very useless rock, reductive but not inaccurate. Suggest lowering ambition further. Attempt a single articulated joint. Prove the hinge moves before you demand it walk. Kael closed his eyes and did what Ashen had drilled into him. Not forcing the pile to become something, but listening first, the way he'd always listened to broken machines. Except the listening ran both directions now. He felt for the thin thread of aether Ashen swore was there, running through his own chest, and pushed a whisper of it into the sand and wire, holding the simplest shape he could imagine. Two flat plates joined by a single wire hinge, able to bend. The pile of sand moved, folded together, folded open, folded together again. A tiny, ugly, undeniably functional joint, built from nothing but sand and a boy's stubborn will. Success. Aether reserve. 34% remaining. Recommend operator not attempt anything further tonight. One more, Kael said, already reaching for more sand. Inadvisable. One more. Hucky got, on his fifth attempt, an actual small construct. A lopsided six-legged thing the size of his thumb, which Ashen's blueprint called a scuttler. He set it down on the packed dirt and, feeling faintly ridiculous, thought at it. It twitched its 6 legs and skittered 6 inches to the left. Scuttle, Kael said, immediately, to no one, because apparently a thing wasn't real to him until it had a name. And this was, in his professional opinion, an excellent one. Your scuttle. That is not a name. That is a description with confidence. It's a great name. Kael laughed out loud, alone in the dark, delighted and lightheaded in equal measure, and then jumped nearly out of his skin at a slow clap from the scrapyard doorway. That, said Wren, arms crossed, eyebrows somewhere near her hairline, is not what an F-rank inventor is supposed to be able to do. A beat, as her eyes landed on the little construct still looping in place. Also, scuttle. Truly the pinnacle of human creativity. It's descriptive. It's lazy, Kael. It's... Okay, so, it's not, Kael started. Got nowhere with any of those sentences, and gave up. Sit down. This is going to take a while. He told her everything. Not because he'd planned to. Ashen made its disapproval extremely clear the entire time, but because Wren had a way of standing in a doorway with her arms crossed that made lying feel like more effort than it was worth, and because 3 weeks of carrying a secret alone had been exhausting in a way he hadn't fully clocked until he set it down. This individual now possesses information capable of ending Operator's current secrecy strategy, Ashen noted afterward, dry as ever. Was this a calculated risk or an emotional impulse? Emotional impulse, Kael admitted, acknowledged. For what it is worth, my risk assessment of the Cabot girl is favorable. You just met her 10 minutes ago. I have been cataloging human behavioral patterns for approximately 200 cycles longer than you have been alive. Trust the assessment. Wren, for her part, took the revelation of a secret ancient machine intelligence living in her best friend's chest with roughly the same equanimity she took everything else, which was to say, she immediately started planning. Okay, she said, perched on the workbench, swinging her feet. Obviously you can't tell Fen the specifics. He already suspects too much, and he's a terrible liar under pressure. Obviously you can't tell anyone in this town. Half of them would report it to the guild by lunchtime, just to see what happens. But you need somewhere to actually test this that isn't a locked scrapyard at midnight. Because eventually you're going to need real space, and real materials, and, She paused, struck by a thought. Fenn's been sending runners out to the deep's outer edge for scrap that washes up after a rift seals near there. Rare stuff, apparently. Half metal, half not quite metal. He hasn't had anyone he trusted enough to send since his arm. Fenn, it turned out, had been listening from the doorway for longer than either of them realized, and didn't bother pretending otherwise. She's right, he said, stepping in, giving the six-legged scuttler on the workbench a long, considering look. There's a supply run to the Deep's first ring tomorrow. Broad daylight, guild escorted, low risk, standard scrap collection. I usually send a hired hand. He looked at Kael. Might be time I sent someone who can actually tell good material from bad on site. Operator's machine communion at Tier 0 would provide meaningful advantage in raw material assessment. Ashen put in, already calculating. Recommend accepting. Kael looked between Ren's delighted grin, Fenn's carefully neutral expression, and the dark smudge of the tree line visible through the scrapyard's open door, and felt his heart pick up in a way that had nothing to do with aether fatigue. Yeah, he said. I'm in. Chapter 7. First Ring. The Ashwood Deep did not look, up close, the way Kael had always pictured it from the chapel steps. From town it was a flat black smudge on the horizon. Ominous, mostly in the abstract, the way a locked door is ominous. Standing at its actual edge, packed into a supply cart with Fenn, 2 crates of collection tools, and a guild escort of 3 hunters led, to Kael's mild relief, by Joran. It was something else entirely. A wall of trees so tightly grown that daylight seemed to give up about 30 feet in, replaced by a deep green-black gloom that swallowed sound the way water swallows a drop stone. First ring only, Joran said, for what was probably the 4th time. Mostly for Kael's benefit. We stay inside the marked trail. We stay in sight of each other. And if I say run, you run toward town, not toward whatever made you want to run. Clear? Clear, Kael said, and meant it, heart already hammering with a mix of excitement and something colder that he suspected was, finally, appropriate fear. The first ring, it turned out, was less a hunting ground than a boundary, thin enough that sunlight still reached the forest floor in patches, well patrolled enough that Fenn's scrap collection runs came here regularly without serious incident, but well patrolled did not mean safe. And within the first hour, Kael understood, viscerally, why nobody sent an unescorted 15-year-old out here. System notification. New environment detected. Ashwood Deep, first ring. Machine communion range expanded. Ambient rift residue in this zone increases construct detection radius by approximately 40%. The residue Ashen meant was everywhere. Kael could feel it the moment he stepped past the tree line, the way a half-dozen scattered fragments of rift-touched material hummed faintly against his awareness like distant, half-heard voices, layered over the ordinary silence of a normal forest. He found himself drifting off the marked trail almost immediately, hand out, following the thread of a hum toward a half-buried scrap of dull, gray-green metal identical in color to Ashen's housing. That's the good stuff, Fenn said, watching him dig it free. And then, when Kael held it up with the particular satisfaction of someone who'd guessed right about a wear pattern from 30 feet away. Is that so? Which was as close as Fenn ever came to actual enthusiasm. Most collectors just grab anything shiny. You're finding the stuff that's actually worth something. Confirmed. This fragment carries residual aether-conductive properties. Recommend collection. Estimated synthesis efficiency improvement, 15% when incorporated into future constructs. Kael was 3 more finds into an increasingly satisfying afternoon. A coil of strange half-metal wire, a fist-sized chunk of something Ashen called stabilized rift glass, a gear housing unlike anything Fenn's shop had ever stocked. When Joran's low, urgent whistle cut through the green gloom, and every hunter in the party went still. Don't move, Joran said quietly and pointed, perhaps 60 feet off the trail. Half swallowed by underbrush and dappled shadow, something was watching them. It took Kael a long, disorienting moment to even resolve its shape against the foliage. Long-limbed, low, its hide patterned in mottled greens and browns that shifted, subtly, to match the light around it. Two pale eyes, the only fixed point in an otherwise camouflaged blur. System notification. Beast detected. Bramble stalker. Estimated rank. C. Threat assessment. High for current party composition. Recommend absolute stillness. Do not engage. C rank. Joran breathed, one hand raised in a slow, universal nobody move gesture to the rest of the party. First ring's not supposed to have anything past D. That's new. His voice had the particular flatness of a man doing very careful math about survival odds. Everyone. Slow. Back toward the cart. Nobody run. They backed away in aching, deliberate silence, the bramble stalker's pale eyes tracking them the entire retreat, without its long body ever quite fully moving, until the tree line opened up again, and the ordinary, blessed daylight of the fields swallowed them whole, and Joran finally let out a breath like he'd been holding it since he first spotted the thing. That, he said, once they were safely loaded back into the cart and rattling toward town, is getting reported to the guild tonight. C rank in the first ring means something's pushing the deeper stock outward. Not a good sign, this close to awakening season. Kael sat quietly amid the crates of scrap, turning the strange coiled wire over in his hands. Ashen's steady presence humming faintly behind his ribs, and thought about Denner's words from a week ago. More things running for the tree line instead of dying like they're supposed to. And understood, for the first time, that it hadn't been idle worry at all. Well, Wren said later, when he told her, unable to help herself even through the visible fear on her own face. At least you found good scrap. Kael laughed despite himself, and despite everything, and went to bed that night, with his mind full of gear ratios and camouflaged pale eyes in equal measure. Chapter 8. Six-Legged Justice. Bryce Calder had not, in the weeks since Awakening Day, run out of new ways to make Kael's life difficult. It started small. A shoulder check in the market square. A accidental shove into a puddle. But E-rank spearman training had put actual muscle behind Bryce's carelessness now, and by the fourth week, it had escalated to Bryce and his two friends. Thick-necked, slow knock, and thin, eager-to-please Pell, cornering Kael behind the chapel and confiscating the pouch of scrap parts he carried everywhere. What's an F-rank inventor even need scrap for? Bryce said, dangling the pouch out of reach, grinning at the small crowd of younger kids who'd gathered. Because Bryce had discovered that cruelty performed for an audience felt better than cruelty performed alone. Gonna fix something. Gonna tinker? The old Kael, a month old, a lifetime ago, would have gone red and silent and let it happen. The new Kael reached into his coat pocket, closed his hand around something small, and thought, very deliberately, at the little six-legged shape tucked into his sleeve. A new scuttler, built that very morning with a sliver of deep-scavenged wire worked into its joints, sturdier and faster than anything he'd made before. This one was, if he was keeping count, which he wasn't, technically Scuttle the Ninth. He was still calling all of them Scuttle. Wren had given up correcting him around Scuttle the Fourth. Now, the scuttler dropped out of his sleeve and skittered, fast and silent, directly between Bryce's ankles. Bryce didn't notice a thing, not until his next triumphant step caught against a tiny construct exactly where a foot should never expect an obstacle. And he went down face first into the dirt with a startled, undignified yelp that echoed off the chapel wall. The crowd of younger kids, 30 seconds ago laughing at Kael, dissolved instead into helpless giggling at Bryce. Sprawled in the dirt with his own scrap pouch bounced free of his hand and rolling toward Kael's feet. There's nothing even there, Bryce said, twisting around to glare at the flat, empty dirt behind him, because there genuinely wasn't anything there anymore, and that was somehow worse than if there had been. I didn't just... Shut up! Shut up, Pell! Kael picked it up, dusted it off, and said, with a straight face that took every ounce of willpower he possessed, "Careful. Uneven ground. System notification. New application detected. Synthesis constructs deployed in tactical/defensive context. Minor experience gained. Blueprint synthesis. Tier 0, 68% to Tier 1. Operator's tactical application was inefficient and unnecessarily theatrical." Ashen noted that night. A direct trip mechanism required 40% less Aether investment and would have achieved identical result. It wouldn't have been as funny. Funny is not a tracked metric. It should be. It became, over the following 2 weeks, a quiet and enormously satisfying pattern. Never a direct confrontation, because Kael wasn't stupid and an E-rank spearman could genuinely hurt him if provoked into real anger, but a steady stream of small, deniable, perfectly timed inconveniences. A door swinging shut half a second before Bryce reached it. A loose board reinforced everywhere except one specific 6-inch stretch where Nock liked to stand and heckle. A construct no bigger than a beetle, living in the chapel gutter, that untied bootlaces with patient mechanical precision whenever Pell walked past on his way to gloat. Wren, sworn to secrecy and delighted beyond all reason, took to positioning herself within sight of each accident, purely so she could watch Bryce's face, and had to bite down on her own knuckles more than once to keep from laughing loud enough to give the whole scheme away. "You realize," she said, wiping her eyes after the bootlace incident sent Pell sprawling into a fish cart, "that you have accidentally become the single funniest person in Ashenreach, and no one is allowed to know it's you. That's genuinely tragic. You deserve an audience." "I have an audience," Kael said. "You. I'm a wonderful audience, but I'm one person, Kael. This is criminal underuse of comedic talent." Operator's approach demonstrates unusual grasp of asymmetric engagement for a Tier 0 machinist, Ashen put in, dryly, after the 5th such incident. Most low-tier operators in archived records attempted direct confrontation and achieved poor outcomes. This is sound strategy. You almost sound proud of me. Incorrect assessment. I am an ancient construct intelligence. I do not experience pride. A pause. Distinctly, suspiciously long. Continue current approach. It is effective. The world hadn't gotten any kinder. Bryce still swaggered around town like he owned it. Still hadn't connected 4 separate humiliations to the quiet F-rank inventor he barely bothered to notice. But underneath that, quietly, invisibly, something extraordinary was building itself, one small synthesized part at a time. And Kael Rennick, for the first time in his life, had a secret that made him feel powerful instead of ashamed. It wouldn't stay small for long. 3 days later, the deep decided to remind him exactly how small it still was. Chapter 9. The Fissure at Miller's Field. It started as a favor. Old Fen needed a repaired plow hitch delivered to the Hallow Farm out past Miller's Field, close enough to the deep's fringe that most runners went in pairs. And Wren, bored of a week spent transcribing merchant ledgers, invited herself along for the walk, which both of them understood to mean for the company. It was an ordinary Tuesday, which Kael would later think was somehow the worst part, that the world could tear itself open on a day with nothing else planned. The rift opened without warning, the way they always did. A silent, vertical seam of wrongness splitting the air above the fallow field ahead of them, edges shimmering like heat haze over a road that had never been that hot. Kael had seen rifts before, from a safe distance, cordoned off by hunters within minutes. He had never been standing directly in front of one when it tore. "That's not supposed to be here," Wren said, very quietly, already backing away. "That's not near the deep at all. That's practically on top of the..." The first dusk hound came through before she finished the sentence. Then a second, a third, lean, black-hided, veins of faint violet light running under their skin. And behind them, larger, heavier, a jagged scar splitting one eye milk-white, something that made every hair on Kael's arms stand up the moment it cleared the seam. System notification. Ween ring. Hostile Rift Entity Pack detected. Estimated pack rank E, X4. Estimated alpha rank D. Scarred Duskhound, pack leader. Operator combat rank E. Provisional. Survival probability against full pack in direct confrontation low. Recommend immediate retreat. Ashen, Kael said, voice tight, already grabbing Ren's sleeve and pulling her backward. Talk to me. Retreat is optimal. Pack behavior suggests territorial defense of the breach point. If you run, they may not pursue past a fixed radius. Recommend testing this immediately. They ran. For about 4 seconds, it worked exactly like Ashen predicted. The 4 lesser duskhounds hung back near the seam, snarling but not chasing. Then the alpha threw its scarred head back and let out a sound that was not quite a howl, and all 4 lesser beasts broke formation and came after them at a dead sprint. And Ashen's calm, clinical voice went sharp with something that, in a human, would have been called alarm. Correction. Retreat is no longer optimal. You cannot outrun them. Miller's Field terrain. Open. Minimal cover. Operator. I need you to think, right now, faster than you have ever thought in your life. Kael's mind, in the 3 seconds he had before the lead duskhound closed the gap, did what it always did under pressure. Stopped panicking and started calculating. Because panic had never once fixed a broken gear, and some deep, stubborn part of him refused to believe it would work any better here. Ren. The old drainage ditch. 40 feet past the split oak. Get to it. Get low. Don't look back. I'm not leaving you. You're an F-rank scribe against 4 E-rank duskhounds. Ren, you are leaving me. I need you alive to tell people how this went. She went. He hated every second of watching her go, and it bought him exactly the room he needed. Kael dropped to one knee, both palms flat against the packed dirt of the field, and did the thing Ashen had drilled into him 100 times in the dark of the scrapyard. Except instead of careful, patient shaping, he shoved every scrap of aether he had directly into the ground in front of the lead duskhound's charge, holding the crudest possible blueprint in his mind. Soft. Soft. Give way. The packed earth crumbled into loose rubble, exactly as the beast's full weight came down, and its charge folded into a snarling, thrashing collapse 3 feet short of him. 2 more were still coming. He had, at absolute most, 4 seconds and less than half his aether reserve left, and Ashen was already screaming warnings about backlash that Kael didn't have the luxury of listening to. He grabbed the wire spool from his coat, thought at the 3 scuttlers he'd tucked into his sleeve that morning, out of pure paranoid habit. Sorry, 7. Sorry, 8. Sorry, 9. I know, go, and sent them skittering directly at the 2 closing duskhounds' legs. Not to fight them. Nothing that small could fight them, but to wrap. Thin, deep-forged wire looping and tangling around already uneven strides, buying one more precious half-second of chaos. It wasn't enough for the alpha. The scarred duskhound cleared its lesser packmates in a single bounding leap, jaws already open. And Kael, out of scuttlers, nearly out of ether, no time left to think, did the only thing left. Threw himself sideways into the collapsed rubble crater he'd made a moment earlier, felt teeth close on empty air a hand's width from his shoulder, and shoved the last dregs of his aether not into a new construct, but into the loosened, rubble-soft ground directly beneath the alpha's landing stride. The same trick as before, cruder, more desperate, aimed at a beast 3 times the mass of the lesser hounds. It half worked. The alpha's forelegs sank to the knee in suddenly unstable earth, its charge crumpling sideways instead of connecting. And in the half-second that bought him, an arrow took it through the throat from behind, and Joran's voice was shouting his name across the field, and the world tipped sideways into ringing silence as Kael's aether reserve bottomed out completely, and his vision started crowding with black at the edges. Operator. Operator, stay conscious. This is important. Ashen's voice, uncharacteristically urgent. The Alpha's core is destabilizing on death. You have perhaps 30 seconds to make a decision. Absorbing a D-rank core at your current E-rank capacity carries genuine backlash risk, but refusing means the energy disperses uselessly into the ground. Your choice, operator. Choose now. On his knees, in a crater of his own making, blood roaring in his ears, looked at the small, pulsing violet crystal already forming where the Alpha had fallen, and thought, with the same stubborn calculation that had gotten him through every second of the last 4 minutes, I did not survive this to leave something on the table. Do it, he rasped, and reached out a shaking hand. System notification. Core absorption. Scarred dusk hound. D rank. Success. Partial backlash. Significant experience gained. Blueprint synthesis. Tier 0, Tier 1. Machine communion. Tier 0, Tier 1. Class rank reassessed. Machinist, F rank, E rank. New skill unlocked. Core infusion. Residual beast core fragments may be embedded into constructs, permanently improving durability, speed, or ether efficiency. Fragment quality scales with beast rank. The machinist's arsenal is built one hunt at a time. Backlash noted. Operator pushed absorption beyond safe current tier threshold. Recovery time extended. Recommend operator never do that again. First combat kill logged. First core absorption logged. Evolution path options expanding. The world went dark shortly after that, and the last thing Kael was aware of was Ren's voice, close and furious and terrified all at once, and Joran's hands checking him for injuries with the brisk efficiency of a man who had done this too many times. And, underneath it all, Ashen's steady, patient presence humming quietly behind his ribs like a held breath finally released. Chapter 10. Blueprint for Tomorrow. He woke up a full day later on a cot in the Hunter Outpost infirmary. Throat dry. Every muscle aching like he'd been dropped from a height, with old Fenn's worried face hovering over him, and Ren asleep sitting upright in a chair, still in yesterday's dirt-streaked clothes. You, Fenn said, low and rough, are never doing that again. Worked, though, Kael croaked. That was apparently loud enough to wake Ren, who startled upright, blinked at him twice, and said, with the particular eloquence of someone 3 seconds out of a bad sleep, you absolute idiot, I thought, and then didn't finish that sentence, just got up and hugged him hard enough that he wheezed, which was somehow more convincing than anything she could have actually said. It worked. It also nearly killed you. Both statements are true. Please attempt to internalize the second one before the next crisis. Also, Ren said, once she'd released him, and wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand. You should probably know that one of your little machines followed me here. She reached into her coat pocket and set something on the blanket beside his hand. A scuttler, or what was left of one. Scuttle the ninth, mangled from the fight. One leg torn away entirely. Wire casing scored with tooth marks. And, impossibly, still moving, still upright, still turning its dented little body toward Kael the moment it touched the blanket. It crawled out of the wreckage after they carried you off. I tried to leave it. It followed me. Kael, it followed me for half a mile. Kael stared at it. Tier 0 constructs fell apart in days. Ashen had been explicit about that from the very first drill. Structural lifespan measured in days, not permanence. This one had taken a duskhound's full weight, lost a limb, spent its entire binding holding a beast 300 times its size, and was still, stubbornly, here. Ashen. Why is it still working? I do not know. A pause. And from Ashen, an honest "I do not know" landed heavier than any answer could have. Its aether binding should have collapsed during the engagement. Instead, it appears to have stabilized, possibly your communion resonance, under extreme circumstance, imprinted something more durable than a standard binding. Possibly something else entirely. I would recommend keeping it. I would very much like to observe what it does next. Kael picked the little machine up, careful of the missing leg, and it settled into his palm the way it had once settled onto a workbench in a dark scrapyard. Patient and inexplicable. "Old Scuttle," Wren said, watching. And for once there was no teasing in it at all. "That one's earned a real name. That one's Old Scuttle." Kael didn't argue. It was, everyone would agree for years afterward, the only construct name he ever got right. News that the F-rank inventor had walked away from a Duskhound Alpha, not unscathed, not gracefully, but alive, with a dead D-rank beast and a scattered pack to show for it, moved through Ashenreach with the particular speed that only genuinely surprising gossip could manage. Most of the town treated it as a fluke. Bryce, predictably, told anyone who'd listen that Kael had gotten in the way and nearly gotten Joran killed, a version of events that conveniently ignored Joran's own report to the outpost, which described, with visible professional confusion, a boy who had engaged and destabilized a D-rank Alpha through improvised terrain manipulation and reactive synthesis under direct threat to life. One person in Ashenreach did not dismiss it. Lady Seraphine Alcarn was 17, the only daughter of the noble house that governed the district, and had spent her entire life being extremely bored by almost everyone she was required to be polite to. She found Kael 8 days later, back at the scrapyard, still favoring one arm, carefully rewinding wire around a new Scuttler prototype, while a battered, 5-legged little machine supervised from the edge of the workbench, with what could only be described as an air of seniority. "You're the inventor," she said, without introduction. "The one who put a D-rank Alpha into a hole he made with his bare hands, and then absorbed its core without dying." "Mostly without dying," she amended, glancing at his still bandaged arm. Kael looked up, startled, recognizing the Alcairn crest even before she finished speaking, and felt the familiar reflexive weariness 3 weeks of public humiliation had trained into him. "I got lucky. Adrenaline. People don't improvise field-grade synthesis and survive a D-rank core absorption on pure adrenaline," Seraphine said, flat and unhurried. "My father's steward has been fielding guild correspondence about this for 2 days, Inventor. I'm not here to expose you, if that's what you're worried about. I've sat through 11 years of awakening days watching this town throw parties for every mediocre swordsman who can hold a blade in a straight line. And I am, frankly, starved for something interesting." She crouched, unbothered by the dirt, and looked at the scuttler in his lap with open curiosity rather than the polite disdain he'd learned to expect. "What is that?" Kael hesitated, weighing weeks of hard-won secrecy against something he hadn't felt directed at him in a long time. Someone looking at his work and seeing possibility instead of a punchline. He noticed, in the pause, that she'd tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. A small, unconscious thing he'd later learn was the closest Seraphine Alcairn ever came to admitting she cared about something. "It's called a scuttler," he said slowly. "This one's Scuttle. So was the last one. And the one before that." Seraphine gave him a long, unreadable look. "You've named more than one thing Scuttle." "Ha, me. I ran out of ideas around the 4th one and just kept going." "And that one?" Seraphine nodded at the battered 5-legged veteran on the workbench edge, which had been tracking her the entire conversation with its dented little body, angled like a chaperone's. "That's Old Scuttle. It survived the Duskhound fight when it shouldn't have, and it hasn't fallen apart since, which it also shouldn't have." Kael shrugged, honest. "It earned the upgrade." "That's the worst thing I've ever heard," she said, and there was something almost like delight underneath the flatness of it. Show me how it works, caution advised, Ashen murmured. This individual possesses significant social and material resources. Continued association carries both elevated opportunity and elevated risk. A pause, considerably shorter than the caution warranted. Her interest in the mechanics is unusually well-informed, however. Recommend continued observation. Kael, watching Seraphine's eyes light up as the tiny construct skittered across the scrapyard floor, decided he agreed. That night, alone in the scrapyard, Kael sat cross-legged in front of the still slumbering gray-green housing that had started all of this and pulled up. For the first time, the full evolution interface Ashen had been steadily unlocking. System notification. Current class, Machinist, E rank, Tier 1. Evolution branches detected, preliminary data only. Artificer, precision over speed, complex, multi-part constructs. War Machinist, combat integrated synthesis. Weapons, fortifications, higher aether cost. Gaulomancer, fewer, bigger constructs, bound with a lasting will of their own. Rare, Drone Sovereign, many small constructs, one mind directing them. Scales with focus, further branches locked. Choice, once made, defines what comes after. Choose deliberately. Data corrupted. One designation recurs across several damaged fragments, never fully legible. Recommend operators stop trying to read a word that isn't ready to be read yet. Helpful, Kael muttered. Reading the corrupted line a third time anyway, like it might resolve itself out of spite. It will not. You could just tell me. I could. I am choosing not to. On the grounds that you are 15, extremely impatient, and would very likely do something reckless with the information. Read the 4 branches you can actually see. Kael read them again. Artificer, War Machinist, Gaulomancer, Drone Sovereign. Turning each one over the way he turned over a broken gear, looking for the wear pattern, the shape of what it wanted to become. I don't have to choose yet, he said out loud. Correct, but it is not too early to begin preparing. Every construct you build between now and that choice will shape which branch suits you best. There was a knock at the scrapyard door before he could answer. Too late for Wren. Too formal for Fen. Denner Holt stood in the doorway, with a folded letter in his hand, scratching the back of his neck in the way he did whenever paperwork was about to become somebody's whole life. So, got something odd through the guild courier this week, he started, and then stopped, and started again, because apparently even he hadn't figured out how to say this on the walk over. Routine records request, capital registry, cross-checking awakening rolls against a missing persons file that's been open a long time. Your name came up, Kael. Not the way you'd think. He held the letter out, like it might be heavier than it looked. Says you've got a birth registration on file in the capital. Different surname. Filed by a family that's apparently been looking for a boy about your age for 15 years. Kael went very still, the evolution interface still glowing faintly, forgotten, in the corner of his vision. That's not possible, he said. I'm an orphan. I've always been an orphan. Maybe, Denner said, not unkindly, setting the letter down on the workbench like it might bite him. Or maybe the deep's not the only thing around here that's been keeping a secret for 15 years. He didn't have anything else useful to say after that, so he left, and Kael sat alone with the letter for a long minute before he trusted his hands enough to pick it up. Beginning synthesis drill 47, Ashen said. Mostly, Kael suspected, to give him something else to think about. Try not to overextend this time. There is, I suspect, a great deal more ahead of you than either of us has planned for. Kael picked up the letter with hands that hadn't quite stopped shaking, and, for the first time in his life, did not know at all what came next. Chapter 11. What the letter said. He didn't open it that night. He told himself it was because his hands were still shaking too badly to manage the wax seal without tearing something he might regret tearing. which was true, but it also wasn't the real reason. And Ashen, tactfully, for once, didn't push. He opened it the next morning, at the chapel kitchen table, with Wren on one side reading over his shoulder without asking permission, and Father Bastian on the other, pretending to mend a hymnal so he'd have an excuse to stay in the room. The letter was shorter than Kael expected. Official capital script, dense and looping. A wax seal, stamped with a sunburst crest he didn't recognize, to the Guild Registry Office. Ashen Reach District. Regarding cross-reference match. Missing persons file 0417. House Solari. Subject. Male, approximate age 15. Last confirmed location, the Ashwood Deep vicinity. Disappearance coinciding with a rift event 15 years prior, requesting confirmation of identity via resonance record and formal notification to surviving family. Currently resident at the capital. House Solari has maintained an open inquiry for the full duration and requests expedited response. There was more. Dates. Registry numbers. A description of a birthmark Kael had never once thought to mention to anyone, because it was just a mark on his shoulder, the kind of thing you stop noticing about your own body. But that was the part that actually landed. House Solari has maintained an open inquiry for the full duration. 15 years. Someone had kept looking for 15 years. House Solari, Wren read aloud, slowly, like the words might mean something different if she said them carefully enough. That's Kael. That's not a small name. I've heard that name. My uncle used to trade dyed cloth up toward the capital. House Solari's, one of the old merchant lines. They've got a seat on the... She stopped herself, visibly recalibrating the entire shape of who her best friend might turn out to be. I don't know them, Kael said, which was true, and also somehow the least useful sentence he'd ever said in his life. Father Bastian set the hymnal down. You came to us as a foundling, he said, gently, the way he said most things. Sister Marin found you at the chapel steps herself, wrapped in a traveling blanket that wasn't local wool. We always assumed someone had left you there because they couldn't keep you. It never occurred to any of us that someone might have been looking. Old Fen didn't say anything at all when Kael brought him the letter that afternoon. He read it twice, set it down on the workbench, and went very quiet in a way that made Kael's stomach drop before he even understood why. Fen? 15 years, Fen said, finally, not looking up. Same season a rift sealed at the deep's edge and left that machine of yours half buried in the dirt. Same season I saw a boy in the wreckage talking to scrap metal and lost track of him before I could get close enough to ask his name. He looked up then, and there was something in his face Kael had never seen there before. Not quite fear, not quite hope. Some complicated third thing sitting uneasily between them. I never said it out loud because it sounded mad even to me. But I've had 15 years to do that math, kid, and it's never once come out any other way. Kael sat with that for a long moment, the letter still in his hand, Ashen's presence unusually silent behind his ribs. You think I'm him, he said. The boy from the crater. Insufficient data to confirm, Ashen said, quiet, almost careful. But I would note that my own memory of that period is corrupted specifically around the point of extended dormancy, which is consistent with a bond interruption rather than simple age. I do not know the answer, operator. I would very much like to. That's not comforting. It was not intended to be comforting. It was intended to be honest. Kael looked at the letter again. House Solari has maintained an open inquiry for the full duration, and thought about 15 years of an orphan's life spent believing nobody had ever wanted him in the first place, and felt something complicated and unfamiliar settle into his chest, alongside the shame and the anger and the strange new hope. All of it tangled together in a way he didn't have a blueprint for. I need to think, he said. Take your time, Father Bastian said. Whoever you decide to be, you'll still be welcome at this table. Wren, who had been suspiciously quiet through all of it, finally spoke up. For what it's worth, she said, bumping his shoulder with hers. If it turns out you're secretly rich, I expect better bread than Sister Marin's. Kael laughed, wet, startled, grateful, and folded the letter carefully back along its creases, and did not, for several more days, write a reply. Chapter 12. Bryce's Last Straw. Bryce Colder had spent a month and a half not connecting a string of increasingly suspicious accidents to the quiet F-rank inventor he barely bothered to notice. This, it turned out, could not last forever, mostly because Pell Dunmore was a coward with a big mouth and an even bigger grudge. I saw it, Pell told Bryce, at a volume Kael could hear clearly from the other side of the market square, which meant it was not, strictly speaking, a secret. Behind the chapel. Little metal thing ran right between your boots. I saw it move on its own, Bryce. I'm telling you. You're telling me a rock tripped me, Bryce said, unconvinced, and then paused, visibly recalculating several weeks of doors and bootlaces and uneven boardwalks. Rennick, he said slowly, testing the shape of the accusation in his mouth like it might taste different than he expected. Rennick's little scrap toys. By the time Kael found out how far the rumor had traveled, it had already reached the point where Bryce was telling anyone who'd listen that the inventor had been cheating him for weeks with rigged traps, which, Kael thought, privately, with the specific outrage of someone being falsely accused of something he'd actually done, was an infuriatingly accurate accusation delivered in the most insufferable possible way. Bryce cornered him at the scrapyard 3 days later, Nock and Pell flanking him, all three of them wearing the particular swagger of boys who'd decided in advance how a confrontation was going to go. Show me, Bryce said. Whatever you've got, show me right now, or I go to the guild and tell them an F-rank inventor's been running unregistered constructs around town. Recommend de-escalation. His threat has genuine teeth. Unregistered construct activity is a real regulatory concern, even if the guild's enforcement priorities are currently elsewhere. I don't have anything to show you, Kael said, which was, again, technically a lie, and also the only card he had left to play. You think I'm stupid? I think you're standing in a scrapyard demanding proof of something you can't actually describe, Kael said, and felt some small, reckless part of himself enjoying this far more than was wise. What exactly did you see, Bryce? A rock? A bug? Because Pell's story keeps changing every time he tells it. It worked. Mostly because it was true, and mostly because Bryce's confidence had never once in his life had to survive contact with someone who could out-argue him on details. But it worked badly. Bryce's face went from smug to furious in about 2 seconds flat, and he shoved Kael hard enough into the workbench that a half-finished scuttler frame clattered to the floor between them. And for one very long, very silent second, all four of them looked down at it. It was obviously not a rock. Nobody moved. Then Fenn's voice cracked across the scrapyard like a whip, sharper than Kael had ever heard it. Get out of my yard, Colder, all three of you. Now. Bryce, to his credit, did not argue with a one-armed man who sounded like that. He left, dragging Nock and a visibly relieved Pell with him, but not before turning back at the gate with a look Kael recognized. Not defeat, not really. The look of someone recalculating, again, and not liking where the math was heading. This isn't over, Rennick, Bryce said, which Kael privately thought was possibly the least original thing anyone had ever said to him, and did not tell Bryce that, because provoking an E-rank spearman twice in one afternoon seemed, even to Kael, like tempting fate. That was closer than I would have preferred, Ashen said. Once the gate had swung shut, he saw the frame. Not it working. There's a difference that will not survive a second incident. Recommend increased caution. Fenn, riding the fallen workbench with his one good arm, didn't say anything for a while. Then, boy's not wrong to be angry, even if he's an idiot about it, he said, which surprised Kael enough that he actually turned around. Spent his whole life being told he's the important one in this town. First real threat to that story, And it's the kid everyone laughed at Awakening Day. That'll do things to a person. He shrugged. Doesn't make him less of a problem. Just makes him a predictable one. 2 days later, word reached the scrapyard that a Hunter Guild carriage had been sighted on the eastern road, a full day early, kicking up dust the whole way down into the valley, and that it was carrying, according to the outpost runner who'd spotted it, someone the guild only sent out personally when a rumor was worth taking seriously. Kael, elbow deep in a scuttler he was very deliberately not thinking about Bryce while building, felt his stomach drop for an entirely new reason. Chapter 13. The Recruiter. Captain Mira Halden did not look, on first impression, like someone whose arrival could upend a town. She was somewhere in her 30s, travel-worn, with the kind of weathered practicality in her posture that suggested she'd spent more nights in field camps than actual beds, and the first thing she did upon stepping down from the guild carriage in Ashen Reaches Square was look around at the modest buildings, the dusty road, the small crowd already gathering to gawk, and say, to no one in particular, smaller than the file made it sound. "Ma'am," Denner said, hurrying over, scratching the back of his neck in the specific way he did when his entire day was about to become significantly more complicated. "Wasn't expecting talent division out here for another." "Wasn't expecting to come," Halden said, not unkindly, already scanning the crowd like she was cataloging it. Then a guild archivist cross-referenced a missing persons file against your awakening rolls and flagged an anomaly on the same boy your outpost's been filing increasingly strange incident reports about for 2 months. D-rank Alpha, destabilized with improvised terrain manipulation. F-rank Inventor, with an Aether signature that doesn't match the class. I don't chase every strange rumor that crosses my desk, Officer Holt. I chase the ones that show up twice from 2 different directions. Kael, watching from the edge of the crowd with Ren gripping his sleeve hard enough to leave marks, felt Ashen's presence go very still and very focused behind his ribs. She is not wrong about any of it. This is, from a purely professional standpoint, extremely competent work. That's not helpful right now. I did not say it to be helpful. I said it because you should know exactly how much this individual has already figured out before you decide what to do next. Holden found him within the hour. Not dramatically. Not with guild escorts flanking her. Just a woman walking up to the scrapyard gate alone and leaning against the post like she had all the time in the world, which, Kael suspected, was itself a kind of tactic. "Kael Rennick," she said. "Not a question. That's me. I'm not here to arrest you, confiscate anything, or drag you off to the Capitol in chains, if that's the particular nightmare currently playing out behind your eyes," she said, with the dry, practiced patience of someone who dealt with terrified 15-year-olds more often than she'd probably like. "I'm here because the Guild has a vested interest in awakeners whose classification doesn't match their observed capability. And because, separately, and I want to be upfront that this is separate, a missing persons file with your description on it landed on my desk 2 days before the incident report did, which is either an enormous coincidence or it isn't. And I don't especially believe in enormous coincidences. What do you want from me? Today? A conversation." She studied him for a moment, unhurried, the way Seraphine had studied him weeks ago, except with none of the noble curiosity and all of the professional assessment. "Tomorrow, if the conversation goes well, a demonstration. I've read Joran's report on the Duskhound Alpha 3 times, and I still don't fully believe it. And I've been doing this job for 11 years. Operator. This is the exposure risk we discussed. It is also, potentially, an opportunity. Official guild classification would grant legitimate access to resources, training, and second-ring expedition sponsorship currently unavailable to you." Kael looked at Holden, travel-worn, unhurried, watching him with the particular patience of someone who'd clearly decided not to push before he was ready, and thought about 11 weeks of hiding, of small deniable tricks and midnight scrapyard drills, and a class the guild's own registries didn't have a word for. "Tomorrow," he said. Give me tonight to think. Fair, Holden said, and pushed off the gatepost to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, Rennick, whatever the missing persons file turns out to mean, that's not why I'm here professionally. Professionally, I'm here because your Aether signature is the strangest thing I've seen outside the Capitol's own research division. And strange, in my line of work, is usually worth paying attention to. A faint, almost human flicker of a smile. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Nemio? She was, Kael would think later. Absolutely right about that. Chapter 14. Proving it. They did it in Miller's Field, in daylight, with Joran standing well back, and Halden's official resonance kit, a more elaborate cousin of the ceremony lamp, set up on a folding table, like a piece of equipment that had traveled a very long way to be disappointed in someone. Standard procedure is I ask you to demonstrate your class's core function, Halden said, and I write down what I see. Given your registered class as Inventor, I'm expecting you to fix something. Given everything else in your file, I suspect that's not actually what's about to happen. Ren, sitting on the fence rail with the specific tension of someone rooting very hard for a friend without being able to help, caught Kael's eye and mouthed, unhelpfully, "Good luck." Kael took a breath, knelt, and pressed both palms flat against the field's packed earth, the way he had 100 times now in the dark of the scrapyard, except this time, for the first time, in front of someone whose entire job was writing down exactly what she saw. Recommend the full sequence. Communion, then synthesis, then a working construct. Let her see the whole process, not just the result. Half measures invite doubt. Doubt invites further scrutiny. You're sure? I am reasonably confident this woman's report will determine a significant portion of your near-term future either way. Better she writes down the truth. Kael closed his eyes. He felt for the thread of ether in his own chest, felt it answer easier than it ever had before. 3 months of drills had worn a groove into something that used to feel like grabbing at smoke, and pulled a schematic into focus behind his eyes. Not a scuttler this time, but something bigger, something he'd been quietly practicing since the second ring supply run. Still rough at the edges, but real. 6 legs became 8, the body lengthened, articulated, plated with a thin shell of deep-forged alloy salvaged from his own collection. The ground in front of him moved, not collapsing this time, but rising, packed earth and scrap metal knitting together in real time. Joints locking, plating settling, until something the size of a large dog crouched in the field, where a moment ago there had been only dirt. Halden did not say anything for a long moment. Her pen, Kael noticed, had stopped moving entirely. That, she said finally, is not Tier 0 synthesis. Confirmed. Tier 1. Upper range. First successful large format construct. Operator. Your Aether reserve is at 40% and dropping. I would recommend concluding the demonstration. One more thing, Kael said, out loud this time. Mostly for Halden's benefit, and thought at the new construct. He hadn't named it yet, which felt, given recent conversations, like an act of tremendous personal growth. A single simple command. Stand. It stood. It was, by a considerable margin, the least ugly thing Kael had ever built, and some small, proud part of him noted that Ren, on the fence rail, had gone completely silent, which for Ren was possibly more telling than applause. System notification. Formal guild assessment. Machinist. E rank confirmed. Rank reassessed. D rank. Assessment triggered by demonstrated large format synthesis under evaluation conditions. Guild registry update pending. Classification remains provisional pending further data. Halden closed her notebook slowly. The way people close things when they need a moment before they trust themselves to speak. Officially, she said, I am required to log this as an unclassified anomaly pending capital review, because our registry genuinely does not have a category for what I just watched. Unofficially, Rennick, I've seen D-rank warriors with a decade of training who couldn't do what you just did with 3 months and a scrapyard. She looked at him for a long moment, something calculating and not unkind behind her eyes. The capital's going to want you eventually. I'd rather it happen on your terms than theirs. Which means the smartest thing you can do right now is get stronger, fast, on the record, with the guild's backing behind you instead of its suspicion. What does that mean, practically? It means, Halden said, I'm authorizing a supervised second ring expedition. Controlled conditions, experienced escort, and an actual chance to test what you can do against something that isn't a training field. She glanced toward the black smudge of the deep on the horizon. Assuming you're not planning to go easy on yourself, Kael looked at the tireless, patient shape of his newest, unnamed construct, still standing exactly where he'd left it, and felt something settle into place in his chest that was equal parts terror and the specific, addictive thrill of being taken seriously for the first time in his life. No, he said. I don't think I am.